Welcome. Welcome to another edition of Blueprint. I am the host of Taboo Topic, Ken Drew, with my friend Ryan from Between the Liars. Ryan, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Pretty good, pretty good. How's your week been so far?
It's been good. We're in the second week of the semester. It's in full swing. I've got an interest meeting for the Speech and Debate Union. I've got our travel schedule. Like, I've been super productive. It's just been super busy.
Yeah. Do you miss it though, or do you enjoy it?
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes. I've got 7 people who returned from last year that I get to work with, and so I think especially for the speech and debate portion, those are usually, because it's volunteer based. They're like the students you get to work with semester after semester who are the most dedicated. So I love working with those students. I'm also excited we get to travel in person this year because it's been 2 years of virtual tournaments, and I'm over it.
Oh, this is the first time since COVID, basically, you're going to actually do real tournaments?
Pretty much, yeah.
So what's your first destination then in this tour?
Assuming we're like in tournament shape, it'll be down at the University of Southern Mississippi.
Oh, wow. Going down south.
Like it's like south. A 6-hour drive from here. So
yeah. Are y'all taking the bus?
Yeah, we get a little 12-passenger van, and I drive us down there.
Nice. Well, folks, in case you were wondering, as far as the countdown music, I want to go ahead and give that credit to my friend Devin Farley. He did it for free, so he only asked that I give credit to his music, his tracks. So please be sure to hit the like button to show his appreciation. Also, hit the subscribe button as well if you're on Taboo Topic or even Between the Liars watching this. Show us some love. Help us beat the algorithm, and share this with your friends and family members. Also, I know most of us don't do it, but hit the notification bell as well if you can. That way you get notified whenever a new episode comes out from either Ryan's Between the Liars or my show, Taboo Topic. And with that said, folks, listen, this is going to be the last episode concerning Congress. We're finally going to wrap.
Last episode total, though.
Yes, probably the last episode from the whole series, but last episode for Congress specifically, which I'm ready to move on. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to move on kind of at this point.
I agree. Yeah, it's dragged out a little bit. I think that we've come up with a lot of really good parameters. I like what we've done, but it's what is it?
Do you have your notes this time, though?
I do. As long as you only ask about the last episode, I have my notes.
Well, go ahead and give the audience a quick rundown what we went over last week and the compromises we made that the audience should know, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. So for Congress, all bills and resolutions need to be read out loud. They have to be single issue bills and resolutions. The one exception we made was that you can have like additional pieces tied to it for funding, but you can't do healthcare, student loan forgiveness, green energy all in one boondoggle. It has to be one piece at a time. So we also said that you have to participate in roll call, which we talked about last time. It's the difference between having like the representative of the representatives of the representatives, where they're all not showing up. They're out busy schmoozing, doing their re-elections instead of voting like they're supposed to be. We said that we would give them the exception of virtual roll call if necessary. But I think we said like a few sick days, but by and large, there's very little exceptions we carved out for that. We said Congress doesn't get paid if they shut down. In fact, we said if they reach a shutdown, meaning they couldn't agree on the budget, they couldn't compromise, they stalemated, then every one of them gets fired and cannot be reelected. The state house, so like the Tennessee state house, can impeach the Tennessee U.S. senators.
Yep.
And that goes by state. And we said that the legislator would impeach, and then they would go to the people for a roll, like a full
on a referendum.
Democracy referendum. Yep. And then infringing on the Constitution is grounds for the state legislator to impeach and the people to remove as well. And we said that if your law that you passed or supported goes before the Supreme Court, you're automatically eligible for a recall. It would actually bypass the state legislators and would just go as a referendum right to the people. So, for example, New York, Bruin, and that was a New York law, but like let's say that this was passed at the national level, those senators would automatically be eligible for their people to recall them. Doesn't mean that they will, right? Because New York is probably happy about those types of bills, but we were opening it up. One question here, just to clarify this, I don't think we decided, would that mean that if they pass a state law that they're automatically eligible for a recall, or was it just federal?
I was just thinking federal at the time.
I just want to be sure.
Yeah. As far as states are concerned, like that's their business and how they want to go about it. But as far as the federal government is concerned, yeah, that's the procedures and protocols that we're going to go with. I'm not sure if you want to get into the state. Maybe that's something that's a caveat you want to touch on.
Maybe in my missed points section, I'll think about it.
Okay. Speaking of missed points section, we're going to actually talk about something we've rain checked for the past 2 weeks and part of this closing out finally of this section of Congress, and that is lobbying.
Yes.
Lobbying. So in case people don't understand what lobbying is, there's a lot of controversy. It has a very negative connotation, but essentially it's a independent group that goes on behalf of a certain company or a certain group of people to basically convince Congress to pass laws that would benefit them or they think would benefit the people in general, which most of the time it tends to be more for corporations, and that's where the conflict of interest comes in as far as these corporations have too much power in the sense of, the majority of the money, the majority of the lobbying comes from these corporations and private companies that can afford to basically spend billions of dollars to convince Congress to pass certain laws. But the real issue is, and the main criticism that I got from my research is basically this concept called a revolving door. So what is a revolving door? A revolving door basically is when, let's say you run for Congress, you become a member of the Senate, and you lose your seat, or you retire, and then you go back to the free market, become a lobbyist, and then you go back into Congress, and that's essentially a revolving door. And it can be vice versa too. You can start off as a lobbyist and then enter Congress, and what that happens is essentially kind of this problem with not special interest, but conflict of interest. You become buddy. It's like, hey, Joe, I know you're up for re-election, and I can help you win re-election next year. If you help me pass these bills, I'll donate money to your campaign. And they do that because they know each other so well because of that revolving door. Like they've worked for the company at one point, and they can pass legislation. So that's one aspect of lobbying that I found. Go ahead.
I was going to say it also cuts the other way. So, for example, basic example would be if you don't align with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they can pull your funding, deplatform you. These lobbyists can lobby against you in your primaries or in the primary or in the the general election and say, okay, Ken is no longer supporting, big censorship the way that we would like. So we're going to pick a different candidate. So now you've kind of got both the positive and negative reinforcement there. You have what looks a lot more like bribery. You do this, quid pro quo, we'll fund your campaign. It can also be, if you don't do this or if we're displeased with you, then we'll pick up your opponent, whether it be in the primary or the general election.
Right. And the other issue I found interesting was, let's say Google gets a lawsuit and they lose that lawsuit. And so they spend billions of dollars and they send a lobby group over to DC to basically pass laws that would benefit them. And it's not to say that now this is just me talking. I personally don't necessarily have an issue with that, but it becomes a problem when it supersedes the will of the majority at that point. And that's where a lot of these issues come from. Now, with that said, the last time Ryan and I spoke about this, we didn't really understand the nuances, and we also kept running into the issue of the First Amendment. Because my original idea was any citizen who aspires to run for office must have a minimum of 16 years without any association with lobbying to minimize conflict of interest. I will scratch that idea now, and this is my new proposal. So my new proposal, in the spirit of the First Amendment, but also in the spirit of the fact that there are qualifications, certain criteria, people who want to run for Congress or any public office needs to meet. In order to end this revolving door situation, I'm going to give ultimatum. So if you are a lobbyist and you started off as a lobbyist, you have foregone your right to run for any public office in the future. Now, if you are a member of Congress or president or any federal official, whatever, a cabinet member, if you're in that position, you've never had a position of lobbying before, you have foregone your right to lobby once you're out of office. I think the revolving door situation, that's how you fix that. They could still associate with each other and everything like that, but at least we don't have that revolving door. We have increased the chance of conflict of interest and possibly pass legislation that don't really reflect the will of the people. So that's my first proposal with the lobbying situation. My second proposal, to address the whole corporation situation, or any business for that matter. If you're a company like, let's say, Google again, and you lose a lawsuit, and let's say this lawsuit, let's say this lawsuit was justified by the public eye majority, and Google were to come to persuade Congress to pass legislation that would benefit them, the majority would view that as a slap in the face to the average Joe or Jane. So in order to fix that, I'm going to propose the idea of, then if you're a company and you lose your lawsuit, you lose your right to lobby on behalf of that specific issue for the next 10 years at least. A 10-year ban for lobbying for that specific situation, to where you cannot just go ahead and lobby to change the law for your own benefit. So those are my own proposals, my modified proposals for lobbying. I still stand by that Congress, it kind of goes hand in hand with my original thought as far as Congress cannot consider lobbying as a secondary job anyway. So what do you think?
I want to dive into the first one that you mentioned here, which said if you start as a lobbyist, you cannot run for public office, vice versa. My question is, how do you handle individuals who maybe start in the lobbying sector and then, they're like, oh, okay, I understand this. And this is usually what happens, right? They're like, okay, I've lobbied. Now I want to be the legislator, and I have rubbed shoulders with the right people. I've got the connections. I understand the law, the procedures, etc. And this goes the other way too, right? Like I've served either my max terms, or I want to go back and I want to lobby on behalf of people instead, try to do, broader good, let's say, is their motive. And let's assume the best in them for just a second here. Well, if we pass this, we've eliminated that. Right. I feel like you're being pretty intentional on that. I'm just curious. We had talked earlier about how one of the dangers of imposing the limits, let's just go back to our first episode of congressional term limits, you have people who don't necessarily know what's going on. So then maybe you have either lobbyists who are not as passionate or don't know the ropes, or vice versa, politicians who don't. Are you okay with that?
Yep, totally fine with that.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure. Because I don't know, I understand and I agree with the sentiment you're coming from here, 100%. The revolving door is a huge issue. I'll start by stating that.
Yeah.
I'm more okay with the first part of that you proposed than the part that says if a company loses a lawsuit, you lose the right to lobby on that behalf. So what if it is a company that lobbies, right? Like not just like Google where they've got or Disney would probably be a more recent example, right? Like they didn't necessarily go to a lawsuit per se, but they tried to pressure and get involved in politics, and then they backed way the hell up after a little bit there. If it had gone through as a lawsuit and they had lost that, you would not allow Disney then to, let's say, lobby on behalf of, I'm trying to think how we would capture that. Any legislation close to LGBTQ, is that kind of how that would play out? Okay.
Because I think, to me anyway, it's like just like a criminal situation where if you break that social contract, there are consequences. Okay. And you lose certain rights when you break that social contract. So same applies here, except it would be more of a civil situation.
Is this cutting both ways? So if the company brings a lawsuit and they lose it, or someone brings a lawsuit against them and they lose it, then they're no longer allowed to lobby in any capacity for 10 years?
Ooh, like individual citizens?
No, I mean, just as the company. So let's say I'm Disney, because this could have if it had played out as a lawsuit, it could have cut either way. They could have brought a lawsuit against Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida, the legislators of the state of Florida, and they might have lost that.
Right.
They also might have had the people of Florida bring a lawsuit against Disney, or Ron DeSantis and the legislators bring a lawsuit against them. So they could have won or lost. Do you see what I'm saying? They're either the plaintiff or the what's the other term? They're either the person, the plaintiff or the defendant, right? And if they lose either way, they can't lobby, or is it just if they have a lawsuit brought against them and they lose it?
I think to avoid the semantics of it all, I think it's just universal.
Okay. That brings some consistency. I guess my one thought of where there might be kind of a weak spot on that then is, what about, I guess if they can lose it, then it wouldn't be a frivolous lawsuit. But like, how can we guard against disgruntled people or government operationalizing themselves against an entity to prevent them from being allowed to lobby? So for example, let's say at the federal level, Joe Biden, no, let's back up. Donald Trump doesn't like that Disney is getting involved. So he, as the federal government, brings a lawsuit against them. Let's say it gets upheld then. How do we separate governmental actors from trying to silence companies and prevent them from being allowed to engage in the First Amendment by lobbying? Is there a safeguard we want to put? I'm not saying that that means throw out this idea. I'm just saying we might want a caveat to try and prevent that, because like one of the reasons lobbying is essential is because you mentioned this at the start. It's free speech. I get freedom of association, I get freedom of speech, and I get freedom of association where my money goes to, not just like my physical being. And companies are an extension of the people in kind of the way the Supreme Court has shaped that precedent. So what I'm concerned about is if it could just be stopped by someone levying a lawsuit against them, I'm worried that we'll see government actors either retaliating or just trying to silence companies who are motivated to come after them.
Let me think about that.
Yeah, no, and we can come back too. I guess if I'm trying to think how we could dial this back. We could. There's just got to be some kind of a standard in here that prevents the penalty to be like 12, because like basically this is like a blanket censure note for like a decade.
Yeah. Or how about one presidential cycle then? Would that be more reasonable?
It's definitely better. I'm still worried that we're stepping on the grounds, or at least we could step on the grounds of free speech. And for me, this is, I'm a free speech absolutist, so I would rather, if our laws are either going to overly protect people who are what I would say too involved, versus infringe on the First Amendment, I'd rather have them be more involved than I'd like, personally. That would be my side to error on.
At the same time, though, like you have to wonder, there's got to be like, because most of the time when you lose a lawsuit that proves that you broke a social contract, there has to be some kind of consequence that lets the party know, hey, you lost. You can't be a sore loser about this and try to send someone on your behalf to change the law so you can be on the winning team again.
Okay, so then can you give me then, to help me and perhaps our audience understand a little bit better, can you give me a specific example? Because what you just mentioned as far as breaking the social contract, right there we have a standard, right? Which means that you had to have done something, and then that does provide a more rigorous standard to where I might not think this is infringing on the free speech?
Well, I can't remember off the top of my head, but so let me circle back to that. But that's my main concern, because I don't think, and maybe this gets into another conversation, another episode, as far as like what should constitute as a lawsuit, a justifiable lawsuit, because I've heard some dumb lawsuits before, and I don't think people should just be able to lawsuit anyone just for the sake of lawsuiting, just to get money, kind of deal. So I think that's where you're going with it to an extent, if I'm not mistaken. And except it would be for the case of the government going against the people, or certain private companies just for the sake of they may disagree with them, or they have a personal vendetta. And so I would have to think about that, especially given think about the specific situations.
I could throw this out here, and this would make it more tolerable for me. It could be that the government doesn't get to bring lawsuits, because then that prevents them from being aggressive and removes that as a potential. Even like, I don't even want it to be a potential tool that the government can silence people, or by extension corporations, because I think this is another mistake that we tend to make when we think of corporations as predominantly like Disney, Google. Like, the majority of companies in the US are not conglomerates like those giant companies. They don't have the same amount of money, which is why, a lot of these companies, small businesses, etc., they have those protections, and by extension we have to give it to the larger ones. But I feel like that's where the spirit of that law usually originated. So perhaps if we limited it so that the government cannot bring a lawsuit against corporations that would potentially allow them to be censured, then maybe that would make it so that you would still have the people who could bring a lawsuit, unless you're thinking of a specific instance in which the government does need to be able to go after a corporation. Because like Ron DeSantis didn't even bring a lawsuit against Disney. He just went after their tax exemption status, because he said, if you want to be a political actor, then you pay the taxes of a political actor. You don't get this special carve out. You don't get this virtually unlimited cosmic power, to quote the genie from Aladdin.
I like your idea as far as limiting the government to where, if they're going to do any lawsuits, it can only be against other state governments, kind of deal, or against the federal government. Government can only lawsuit against government if that makes sense.
Yes.
But in the meantime, as far as the people, the private citizens and businesses, they have every right to practice lobbying again and file a lawsuit, towards the government themselves. And if they lose, I mean, you lost. So no, I think
it sounds like jousting rules. You knock them off their horse, you take their armor or their horse, etc. So you're silenced.
Because I don't know, it's one of those things where I think there's just too much power with lawsuits too, to an extent as well.
There is. Well, and it brings money into the factor again. If we're worried about lobbying and money going hand in hand, lawsuits and money sure as hell go hand in hand, because, whoever can hire the best lawyers and things like that, they're going to be the ones, the better representation. They're more likely to do better, or they just bring a frivolous one that ties you up the death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? So I think your suggestion that we maybe bring specifics of ways that we would set standards for lawsuits in a different segment, I'm okay with that. We can in the words of Jen Psaki, circle back and touch on that later, so we don't I don't want to get too into the weeds. I do think it's important we think about it, though.
We can go over that when we start to ratify the Constitution, at least for the 3 branches of government, if you want.
Yep. I like it.
So, but we do agree on the revolving door situation, right?
Yes, that is a problem. I mean, honestly, revolving door anywhere, because even like revolving door going from either presidential cabinet or press secretary straight over to your quote unquote unbiased legacy media, that's a problem too. Like, I will across the board say revolving door is a problem.
So let me ask you this then, for the extra caveat: would you want to apply? I think we already went over this, but do we want to apply that to states as well, or should states decide if they want to go ahead and shut that revolving door as well?
When you say states, do you mean they can't come in at the state level?
Yeah, let's say if someone at the state wants to run for a state position, but they were a lobbyist before, should there be a federal ban across the board to include state elections, state positions, or local positions, or you want the states to decide for themselves?
I think this is where I would let my desire for the states to govern themselves outweigh what I think is the best form, because I don't think it's in the state's best interest to allow these. But at the same time, my driving factor for why lobbying needs to be more restricted, more transparent, is because when California takes the tax dollars and then throws it through some kind of money laundering, or Chicago does this too, to then try and influence national policy, I'm affected. But if California wants to let that happen for California, then they can continue to devolve if they want. So I think that we should allow the states to do it themselves, because like I said, my driving reasoning for this is I want the federal, laws to be limited in scope and to not be able to be, bought by whoever has the most money. And a state can decide that for themselves, I think, because it doesn't affect the other states. Because if I live in that state and it's going to affect me, I can vote against it.
So let's say California, right, decides to, like Gavin Newsom, who was a former lobbyist member, hypothetical world scenario, right? And he wants to run for federal Congress. We still agree that he would not have the ability to run for Congress at the United States at the federal level, correct?
Hey, if I can limit Gavin Newsom from running for president in the next election on the grounds that he was a lobbyist, yeah. No, that's not my sole reasoning for that. But yes, I agree with your example here. He was a lobbyist. Honestly, I think you should have a competency test. Did you run your state into the ground in X, Y, and Z places? You shouldn't be allowed to run for president. But yes, former lobbyists should not be allowed to run at the federal level. States can choose for themselves. Agree.
Okay. And that includes like cabinet members at the federal level. So let's say FBI director kind of deal, like lobbying. If you're a lobbyist, you have forgone that right to hold any office, public office at the federal level.
Yes. Or cabinet members, I would be willing to open it up to a certain amount of time has elapsed. You've been out of the game. That's okay. But I'm leaning towards a blanket ban.
I think to avoid the semantics and getting too far deep in the weeds, I think it's just better to just go ahead and do a universal ban.
Okay, so then once you've gone, so then does it cut both ways? If you've been a cabinet member, not just an elected official, you were appointed, not elected, but you cannot go back into lobbying?
Keep that blanket, yes.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah, nope, that works for me.
All right, so I guess that finally closes, we finally got done with the lobbying section. We'll get into the lawsuit and get into the idea as far as like corporations and their rights, as far as like lobbying on behalf of their own interests when they lose a lawsuit kind of deal. But we'll get into that when we close out the first three branches of government and ratify that part of the Constitution. But speaking of the Constitution, there's been one major change that's been affected in the American eyes for the last 100 years or so. That was not in existence the first 100 years or 150 years of the U.S. Constitution, and that is the Senate. Now, we kind of went over it as far as how Congress would be elected and how the whole process would work. But we kind of like glossed over the Senate because there's some things I want to look into the Senate, the 17th Amendment. For those who do not understand, the 17th Amendment basically gave the people in the states the right to directly vote their senators into office without having to go through the state legislative process. Now, before then, it used to be the state legislators decided who would actually represent at the Senate level in DC. So that's how it used to be done. One of the main issues with this, let's go to James Madison real quick, an opponent of state legislators. He wrote in the Federalist Papers that this would be a double advantage both favoring a select appointment and giving of the state government such an agency in the formation of the federal government as must secure the authority of the former. Now, for those who wanted state legislators to choose senators, such as George Manson, he argued this was a necessary tool to defend against federal overreach. Wendell Pierce, another proponent for state legislators choosing senators, expressed that the contrast between state legislative appointed Senate and a popular elected House would increase the types of interests represented in the federal government. By requiring the consent of two constituencies to any legislation, the people's representatives in the House and state legislators in the Senate, the composition of the Senate was seen as essential as essential to the system of bicameralism. Excuse my pronunciation there, but you get the idea. But they would require the concurrence of two distinct bodies of schemes, representation or pitify. Obviously, this one in the ratification process, but the problem was that politicians started to ignore the Constitution. To keep a long story short, this was known as public canvassing, where politicians seeking the Senate began campaigning for state legislative candidacies, reducing the value of state legislators in elections. The most famous example is actually one of the most famous president, the race between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, when neither candidate was on the ballot for state legislator. So kind of weakening the original intent of state legislators. By the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, 28 states adopted the Oregon system, in which there would be discrete elections for those seeking office of senator, further eroding the power of the legislator. This was a result of having various vacant seats as well, like Delaware. Worst example, like they had 4 years without having a seat in the Senate because of the bureaucracy that was occurring with the state legislators at the time. So the 17th Amendment was passed and ratified. And we have to ask ourselves, Ryan, was this the right decision? Well, in theory, in popular opinion, I guess, would say it's the people. The people can directly vote for their senators. That makes perfect sense. And a lot of people who support the 17th Amendment would say, let the state senators focus on the state, and let the senators in D.C. focus on national concerns. But the problem is it shifted the balance of power, essentially, from you had at least one chamber of Congress that was more concerned with state issues, and you also had the House of Representatives that was more concerned with national interests. And so they were there to at least keep each other in check. And when that went away, now you have a Senate who hasn't really stepped foot in their state probably in years, and they will campaign on behalf of their state, talking as if they actually know the problems in the state, but they really don't know what's going on in their state and how the national policies are affecting their state in particular. To an extent, it seems like it was an overcorrection, this 17th Amendment. The way we went about it was just, sorry if you're thunder, by the way. It's outside lightning. But anyways, it seems like if you were to fix the issue, first and foremost, at least enforce the laws that are in there already, and make it to where they can't just directly run for senator without at least going through the legislative process first, be on the ballot for a state legislator, state senator first, and then they can be qualified to go become a senator for the United States. That could have been a correction they could have made. I also would go say, as far as the whole vacancy situation, let this governor, and I think they do this now in some states, where the governor will actually appoint someone to fill in a vacancy to avoid that vacancy having a prolonged time period where it's completely empty. And so maybe that's another way they could have gone about it. But it seems like overall the 17th Amendment has created more harm than good, I would argue. And thus, an argument should be made to repeal the 17th Amendment and give it back to the states to decide whether or not how they should choose their senators. What do you think?
I think that this whole concept started from and is supported by the idea that we are a democracy. We're not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. We are supposed to elect people who represent us. And this was an extension of that. It wasn't supposed to be a populist vote, right? And that's, everything from the Electoral College being a check on a true democracy to something like this, where it was supposed to be that the state legislators wind up voting on behalf of the people who directly voted for them, for the U.S. senators. And then, like you'd mentioned, the House of Representatives was supposed to be a direct, true, like, populist vote to kind of balance these things out. This was an extension of the checks and balances. Checks and balances didn't stop at the three branches of government being Congress, the presidency, and then the judicial branch. We had lots of little checks, and most of them were aimed at preventing this federalist atrocity that we have now, where the government has amassed huge portions of federal power. So I guess my initial thought here is that we are in this situation in large part, if not exclusively, because we have strayed from those traditional beliefs. And you can make arguments for why this has benefits. Of course, I'm not going to say that there are no benefits to it. I'm not even going to say that, there's not some, good to maintaining at least a portion of the status quo. But I'm more and more in favor of restricting federalism, the power that the federal government has amassed, and give it back to the states. You hit the nail on the head because you were quoting the founding fathers, but still, with this idea that it was supposed to be that, you weren't allowing the federal government to amass too much power. And beyond that, we always talk about how you're supposed to be in touch with the people. If the state legislators appoint you and you want to be reappointed, then you've got almost this, think of it as like a rubber band running from the top of this funnel here, the U.S. Senate, to the state legislators, to the people, because the people will say to the people they're directly electing into the state legislators, you did not represent us well, you're gone. And so they'll be tied very closely to the people, and they will, in theory, be the fruit of them doing this will ultimately come about as we elect people who are more closely tied to what we were put into office to represent. So there's more accountability there. And here's the other part of that. You're holding people who are up for re-election far more to a greater degree of accountability because you can. So for example, let's say a state legislator, they're only up every 2 and 6 years, right? And it kind of mirrors the federal level. It's no longer well, I got to wait 6 years until my federal representative comes back around. It's no. We're much more accountable. And like you said, these people are supposed to be the ones who are like in the heat of the battle, right? On the field, fighting and passing legislation that's supposed to have, in theory, the greatest impact on us. We were never designed to care as much about the federal government legislation. That was supposed to move very slowly, if at all. We were actually set up to be existing within gridlock, where Congress doesn't pass anything, because a true democracy that allowed the 50+1 bare majority to flip-flop would leave us open to the turbulent waters of whatever, the simple majority is thinking at that time, and not what the quote-unquote true will, the 60% filibuster-proof majority, we're supposed to be thinking. It was supposed to not allow for democracy, true democracy, to take place. So I guess those are just kind of my thoughts as I think about, why we should change this back to the way that it was before the 17th Amendment was interpreted in this way.
So do you agree with the situation that was happening back then, as well, as far as the public canvassing? Do you think it was a matter of people just not enforcing the Constitution itself? But it's just Abraham be on the ballot without being on the ballot for state legislature. Do you think that was an overcorrection?
You're asking, do I think it was an overcorrection that like Abraham Lincoln was able to be on the ballot for the presidency?
Do you think that was just an amendment as a way to fix the issue, like a situation like Abraham Lincoln, instead of just enforcing the laws that were already in place? They just said, screw it, we're just going to go ahead make this constitutional amendment do a direct populist vote for the senators in D.C.?
It could have been an overcorrection. I guess I didn't think as much about whether it was an overcorrection or not. I focused more on like where are we now than like why did we. I mean, well, I'm focused on why we got here, but whether or not that was the pivotal moment or like the time in which we overcorrected, I didn't think too much about that. I think that's probably why. Yeah.
So what would you propose to fix a situation like that? Do you think, if we were to like first and foremost, do you agree whether or not we should repeal the 17th Amendment, at least some portions of it?
Yeah, I would probably say rewrite it, not necessarily completely repeal it. I would go back to what the founding fathers had framed and defended in the Federalist Papers. Because like you have John Jay, right? He said the Senate is to be composed of men appointed, I mean, and a woman too, to make it modern, by the state legislators. I presume that they will also instruct them that there will be a constant correspondence between the senators and the state executives. That was the goal. Right. And I think that would return us to a smaller, less federalized government. And I think that would also achieve or at least what I think you and I have as a common goal of getting them back in tune with the will of the actual people. So yes, I think that we would need to reframe it in such a way, but yes, repeal it to the extent that we can do that.
So what do you think about the idea then to at least address a situation like Abraham Lincoln or the Oregon rule, whatever that I just mentioned, make it to where they have to at least be on the ballot for state legislators before they can even, and then at that point they can go ahead and qualify for public office at the federal level.
So
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry, finish that thought.
I was going to say, like, because I'm just thinking about the situations at the time that created the 17th Amendment anyway. And we don't want to run into another scenario where, let's say you're running for senator, even though it's technically in the Constitution that you have to be appointed by the state senators, you're not even on the ballot to be a state senator to begin with. And I'm saying you should at least be on the ballot to be a state senator. And then if you get elected, then you're qualified to run or to be appointed by the Senate to represent the federal level.
So I want to be sure that I'm accurately remembering the scenario. When Abraham Lincoln and Douglas were running,
yep,
17th Amendment, so true populist vote, was already a thing for the Senate, for the U.S. Senate?
It did not exist yet.
Okay.
That was one of the issues, though,
at
the time that led to the 17th Amendment.
Yeah, because you've also, I feel like we're also then running into the issue of like write-in ballots too, right? Because if you're not on and people can't write in for the presidency, et cetera, then like, we might even have to touch on that if we're going to, depending on where we go with this. So the issue that was raised then, just to be sure that I fully understand this, is that they couldn't get on the ballot. What was the process to even get on the ballot then? Or did you have to like basically be in the
problem? Well, the problem was I guess there just wasn't anything explicit in there that said like you had to be in the state Senate to be appointed by the senators at your state legislature.
Okay.
And so they used a loophole essentially to where you don't even have to be on the ballot to be a representative at the state level anyway. And thus you would bypass the appointments from the state senators at the time. Do I make sense?
I think so. So you could really only get elected to the U.S. Senate if you had been elected by the people to the state Senate. Is that correct? Because It was pretty much the pool of people who could move up had to already be elected. Okay. And that is a very common argument as to why we need the populist vote, is because it has like the broader pool of people. It's more inclusive. There's like fewer hoops. I think that I'm open to thinking about reasons why we should keep it broad, but still, like, you don't have to be elected to the state Senate to be appointed, but we keep it to where they appoint them. You know what I'm saying? So they could appoint someone who wasn't elected to the Senate. That's fine. But I actually kind of like the constraints. I like that the people had their voice in the state election where they had the true populist vote. And from there, you could be moved up.
Yeah, I mean, it's still representing the people's voice. It's just an indirect way to do it.
Right. And it puts constraints to where you can't have, Ryan gets elected to the state Senate and he votes and lobbies to get his good friend Ken in the U.S. Senate, right? Like you
Right.
had to also be elected, and then we collectively choose who goes on to represent us. Because the other thing is, if you are good enough in that case to be representing the state, not in the U.S. Senate, but in the state Senate, so you represent your own state in its own self-contained area.
All right.
Then you just get a broader platform, which again is the more that I'm talking about this, I'm getting harder pressed to have a reason that they shouldn't have had to serve at the local level.
What do you mean?
Like they had to have served. Like I'm thinking it's a good idea to make it to where, like reverting completely to where they had to serve at the state level, so before they can be on the ballot and be nominated to move up to the U.S. Senate.
At least from the Senate.
At least for the Senate, yes.
Okay. And then let the House of Representatives be a true populist vote.
Yeah, because yes. Yes. Because there are more people who can represent your state in the House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's by population. And that is still elected by populist vote. Versus the Senate, we tend to have the same two incumbents running the entire time. A state tends to stay the same color, and they tend to stay the same literal people. They don't tend to give anyone else a choice or a chance. And that's fine so long as those people were originally elected by the state people, is what I'm thinking.
So sounds like you're leaning more towards the strict parameters I just set out originally.
Yes, it's taken me a bit to get that out, but
some convincing.
Yeah, well,
or
that's not even convincing, but just like like sometimes the
talking out loud
about something. Yeah, the more you talk out loud, as one does, when you think out loud and you hear it and you say it, you kind of reach conclusions. That's kind of my process that just happened there. So yes, to give you a more concise answer, I think I'm in favor of going back to the way things were pre-17th Amendment.
And add that extra parameter to avoid a situation like Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
Yeah, and that's not to say that I think that Abraham Lincoln didn't do a great job as president.
Right.
But although when we ratify this, we might want to go back and think about the type of restrictions we've placed.
Yeah.
Just because we did set those term limits, and if they want to advance, they might have to spend some time serving their time at the state level. But
fair enough. We'll go over that, the final ratification process.
Yes.
All right, so one more little caveat that also kind of raised concern why they justified the 17th Amendment was a situation like Delaware when they went years without actually having an appointee from the state legislators because of their bureaucracy of whatever's going on at the time. And so I have on here my article, which, by the way, guys, again, if you want to see the actual layout of these ideas, at least from my side, my end of the story, you can go to my Substack, kendra296.substack.com. So anyway, so what I have on here is that the governor's power shall be extended to permanently fill in the vacancy to serve 6 years if the state legislators fail to appoint by the end of the 6-year term in that vacancy. How do you feel about that?
I'm okay with that, and the reason being that it is a temporary, it's a temporary appointment, right? Like they're only appointed as a stand-in so that you have that representation until the people can be called to vote and do it.
Yeah.
And I think there is a standard, like it can't be more than X amount of time, and if there's not, then I want to add one, because the governor can't appoint their person and then those people indefinitely serve. But no, as a stand-in, like we do at times need these people in there, especially, let's say someone retires or gets moved up and there's an important vote. We wouldn't want the voice of the people to not be heard at all. So I'm okay with the governor temporarily appointing, but then it needs to be replaced by someone the people elect. or that is if it's a U.S. Senate deal, then the legislators at the state level who were appointed by the people get to pick and reappoint.
I think I'm following what you're saying.
Or we could just bypass the governor or temporary appointment and just say that because the whole purpose of that was so that the people could vote. We set an election day, but if Congress is in session anyway and we have the state legislators appointing, we could say that then they just must. I mean, California knew that Kamala Harris was VP when they were elected, and then you had like what, a month, 2 months until they were sworn in. So in that time, state legislators need to hold a special meeting and vote for someone to replace whoever is retiring, or whatever the reason for leaving early. Special appointment.
So you think, basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, they would have had enough time anyway to prepare to fill in that vacancy, to where we really don't need the governor's appointee at that point.
That's what I'm thinking. Like, unless there's like a death and Congress can't meet, that's like the only time, because it would be sudden, right? But anytime someone's moved up in a cabinet or whatever, we know with enough time. So I might grant an exception that the governor can temporarily appoint until Congress, the state legislators can elect in the event of like a sudden death or something like that.
We can do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what do you think? I want to hear your thoughts too.
I mean, what I think, I personally, I kind of like that, especially when you think about, because the whole purpose of repealing the 17th Amendment, actually those extra parameters, was so that people had the direct voice again, and / indirect voice, if that makes sense. They had a direct voice in the state legislative process, but then they had an indirect voice as far as the senators that they voted in for. They're the ones who are going to be in charge of appointing someone at the senator and the DC level. And to an extent, when it comes to the governor, kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing that. So I have no issue with your idea. So yeah, I'll give you that. You caved in on my strict parameters, so I'll give you that.
There you go. Yeah, don't just quid pro quo just because, though. I mean, as long as you're comfortable with that, then
quid pro quo.
And I'm happy to hear that. Well, if I cave to your parameters, and I honestly didn't even just cave to your parameters for no reason. Like, I think that there's a well-reasoned argument behind why that should be the case.
No, I mean, what you said makes sense. Like I said, kind of defeats the whole purpose of why we would even repeal the 17th Amendment to begin with. And to avoid a scenario, worst case scenario, the governor could have then appoint someone temporarily for that specific purpose. So, I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
We're not getting too far in the weeds. So, all right. So I know you say you had a point you wanted to bring up beginning of the show as far as last week's. Do you remember what that was? A caveat? Because I think we pretty much covered the 17th Amendment.
Yeah, that goes back to the lobbying, or to the.
No, it had to do with last week's.
It was the
impeachment. The impeachment process.
That's what it was. I just wanted to solidify whether or not state legislators, because so recently, the Supreme Court cases have been decided against states, right? So like the overturning of Roe v. Wade was a state-led thing. It wasn't federally based. And then you had the same for New York Pistol and Rifle Association v. Bruin, which we finally had a ruling on a couple of weeks ago. Second Amendment ruling. New York had basically so heavily restricted Second Amendment privileges that it was a privilege, Second Amendment rights in their state that it was a privilege, and very few people could actually carry a weapon to defend themselves unless you basically knew someone in politics, and that was overturned. So I'm wondering if a state infringes on constitutional rights, if they should be allowed to be repealed. Like, have that
recalled.
Yeah, recalled. Yeah, repealed, recalled. You knew what I meant, but yes, you're correct. If they can be, impeached recalled, and then recalled, through a true
That's
populist?
That's an interesting question. I would say let the states decide for themselves what they want to do with that, but I would add this parameter. They cannot run for a federal position. If, let's say, they want to move up to the federal position, they cannot run for at least go one full presidential cycle, so a total of 4 years from the moment the Supreme Court ruled against this, the state. The people who voted for the passage, whatever, they're ineligible to run for the federal level, the 20-year cap that we came up with, for at least 4 years.
I like that, and I'm just noting that down right here. So states set their own parameters, so basically they choose whether or not to impeach and kick it to the people. So if the states at the federal level, you skip the impeachment process by the state legislators. It goes right to the people to remove them from office and replace them if they if the vote will go up. And then if it's a state infringement, you can be impeached by the state legislators or not, and then it'll go to the people. But the people who had if you are a state legislator, then if I understood you correctly, a state legislator, so anyone who voted for the case that was overturned by the Supreme Court,
and they want to run for Congress at the federal level, they won't be able to run
presidential cycle.
Yeah.
Okay. Although that's not as much of a punishment as I was thinking.
I'm being too lenient now.
Well, the reason I say that is because if they did that at the Senate level, you got a 6-year term. They might not even be done with their term until, and want to run until the next presidential cycle.
Okay, so
you do two.
What would you propose? Two presidential cycles?
Yeah, keep it your cycles. I like your cycles.
Okay.
All right, 2 presidential cycles. So 8 years, you are ineligible to run.
Yep, that's fair.
Okay, I can go with that.
At that point, at least the senators would have at least served one full term at that point. And it sounds like we're going to have to revisit the 20-year cap and maybe extending it a little bit, if anything, when we do the final ratification.
I would also add that not only can they not run for a federal office, they can't be appointed to a federal office. So like they couldn't be, Pete Buttigieg could not go ahead then and be appointed to a cabinet.
I like that. Can't run for president either.
They cannot run for a federal office or be
appointed for a federal office
for 2 presidential cycles. Okay. Yeah, that was my one caveat. That was it. I think we've covered pretty much everything else that I was worried about, let's say.
Well,
wanting to cover.
I think this is actually the shortest episode we've had during this Blueprint series. We started off with basically 2 hours of the first episode. Then the second episode, we started like slowly decreasing, but it was more or less about like we had more common ground, we had less to disagree about, and less caveats to think about as well.
True.
So with that said, do you have like any final thoughts wrapping up Congress?
No, I'm glad to be done with the scum buckets in DC. No, I'm happy. We'll do some tweaking before we ratify for sure, but I like where we've been going, just really trying to go back to reducing federal power. I like this a lot.
And actually giving people that visual. So,
yes.
I think I definitely have gained a much better appreciation for our founding fathers and what they were able to accomplish. Because just with 2 people, as we've mentioned like multiple times, like with just 2 people, it's pretty hard to get something to agree on and say, you know what, this is what we're going to go for. This is what should be constitutional, what's appropriate, etc. I mean, we didn't even come to a full conclusion on the lobbying situation either, if you think about it. Yeah. We just, like, at least for the second portion of the lobbying that I talked about earlier. And that's something we'll have to go back over later on. So, yeah, definitely. It's been fun. With that said, folks, it's been great seeing you this week. Ryan, we'll follow us on our social media platforms because there may be a schedule change coming in the loom. So Be on the lookout for that. Ryan, if you wouldn't mind, close us out.
All right. Yep. Remember that you can find us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Twitch, and Google Podcasts, both Between the Liars and Taboo Topic. You can follow us on our social medias to stay updated. You can follow my crew at Between the Liars, and you can follow Ken and Kenjin Express at Kenjin_Express. Remember that you should like, follow, get those notifications. Just do everything on our YouTube channels. You don't have to be selective here. Follow me on Between the Liars, follow Ken on Taboo Topic, and then you can watch Blueprint from either one of these. And if you enjoy this show or any of our shows, give us a 5-star review and share us with your friends. Help us beat that algorithm. Remember, you can subscribe to our channels. Remember, you can help us envision a smaller, better, more accountable government, and that starts with a blueprint. We'll catch you back here next week. Goodbye for now.